Chapter 11 marks a shift in perspective, moving away from Siota and Bendu's individual struggles to a confrontation between them. The chapter opens with Bendu bursting into Calvin's home, a palpable tension in the air. She's got news and she wants it out. She's found Cobra, the notorious perpetrator from their past. He's holed up at the El Maison Hotel, just a stone's throw away. Bendu's immediate reaction is one of resolve. She's going to confront Cobra, demanding an apology and acknowledgement of the atrocities he inflicted upon their community. But Calvin's response is laced with skepticism. Can Bendu really do that? Is it safe? While he's willing to believe her, he can't wrap his head around why she hasn't shared this sooner. As Bendu is about to leave, Agnes enters the picture, adding another layer of complexity. She's not as convinced as Calvin. Agnes sees Bendu's pursuit of Cobra as a potentially dangerous distraction, even accusing her of deliberately stirring up old wounds. There's a definite sense that Bendu is treading on shaky ground, both physically and emotionally. For Agnes, the trauma of the past isn't something you shake off easily, especially when you're trying to piece your life back together. Bendu's impulsiveness feels reckless to Agnes, who's always been more cautious and pragmatic. The sisters' contrasting reactions highlight a stark reality of the post-war world they inhabit. Justice is not a given. It's something you have to fight for, sometimes against those closest to you. The conflict comes to a head when Bendu mentions confronting Cobra. Agnes warns her that she could be putting herself in danger and urges her to let the police handle it. Bendu's response is firm, though. She doesn't trust the Liberian justice system, especially after seeing firsthand how it failed to protect them during the war. The weight of their past experiences hangs heavily in this conversation, shaping their present actions and reactions. In a striking monologue, Bendu defends her decision, emphasizing that she can't heal without acknowledging the trauma of their past. It's a powerful moment, showcasing the emotional toll the war has taken on her and the length she is willing to go to find closure. Her words echo the sentiment of many survivors who grapple with the lasting psychological effects of conflict, but Agnes remains unconvinced. She believes that Bendu's plan could end in tragedy and questions Bendu's ability to cope with such a traumatic event. Their differing viewpoints underscore the complexities of healing and the challenges of finding justice in a fractured society. Shaw masterfully weaves together themes of justice, trauma, and resilience as the chapter progresses. The sisters' opposing viewpoints become increasingly clear. Siota leans towards forgiveness and reconciliation, while Bendu seeks justice and retribution. Siota's naivety shines through when she asks about a district attorney, showcasing her limited understanding of the justice system and its shortcomings. On the other hand, Bendu's response is resolute. She's determined to hold Cobra accountable for his actions, even if it means risking her own well-being. Calvin adds another dimension to this debate. He sides with Agnes, not out of fear, but because he recognizes the futility of pursuing justice through traditional means. He'd rather take matters into his own hands, hinting at vigilantism as a more effective means of dispensing justice. This introduces a dangerous element into the narrative. With faith in institutions eroded by years of conflict, characters are left grappling with the question of how to achieve justice. In a society where the rule of law has been replaced by survival instincts, Bendu's insistence on doing things the right way appears almost comical. It highlights the painful truth that in the absence of justice, survivors are often forced to navigate a morally ambiguous world. Shaw doesn't shy away from portraying the harsh realities of their situation. Characters like Cobra thrive in environments where justice is weak. It's a stark reminder of the cyclical nature of violence and impunity as the chapter unfolds. Shaw builds suspense, keeping readers on edge. The potential for danger looms large, particularly for Bendu, who seems determined to confront Cobra despite the risks. This creates a sense of unease and raises questions about the lengths to which Bendu is willing to go to seek justice. The ending leaves us with a sense of foreboding. Bendu's quest to confront Cobra has put her in the spotlight, making her a target. The possibility of violence hangs in the balance, underscoring the gravity of the situation. As we close this video, let's take a moment to reflect on the significance of Bendu's journey. She's not just seeking justice for herself, she's advocating for a better future for Liberia by confronting Cobra. She's challenging the status quo and demanding accountability for the atrocities of the past, but her path is fraught with obstacles. Both external and internal, she's up against a deeply flawed justice system and the trauma of her past, but Bendu's story is far from over. And we'll be right there with her in Chapter 12 to see how she navigates these challenges. Chapter 14 charts the wearying reality that justice in post-war Liberia is not just slow, but often clogged by indifference and bureaucracy. And it shows how that reality gnaws at Bendu's stamina and patience. After repeated closed doors at the police and courts, Bendu briefly succumbs to doubt, wondering if Agnes was right, that the whole pursuit is impossible, yet the chapter moves quickly. From despair to reprieve when Calvin produces a high-powered lawyer and then stages a lavish restorative dinner for her. Shaw uses this tonal shift to demonstrate two things at once: the emotional cost that Bendu pays for insisting on accountability her work at the Peace in Practice Center suffers, and the fragile tenderness of the community that rallies around her. Calvin's gesture, romantic, theatrical, and strategic, functions as both respite and reinforcement. It comforts Bendu, legitimizes her quest in social terms, and signals that some people are willing to mobilize real resources on her behalf. The chapter thereby underscores the novel's recurring paradox: seeking justice is isolating and institutionally blocked. Yet personal alliances and small acts of care can nourish the stamina needed to keep going, and Chapter 15 plunges the narrative into a violent turning point that reframes Bendu's campaign from a bureaucratic struggle into a life-or-death confrontation. Moses Varney, exposed and enraged by Bendu's discovery of his identity, reacts with predatory violence. He orchestrates a late-night abduction, beats her, and transports her to a desolate beach with the clear intention of silencing her. Shaw stages this episode as a brutal counterpoint to the civilized rituals of law and dinner parties where courts stall and words circulate. Varney answers with coercion and terror. The chapter shows how fragile the protection systems are God's police. Familial ties when powerful men decide to act outside the law. It also foregrounds Varney's moral rot, his drug use, his paranoia, and his conviction that violence still buys obedience. By driving Bendu into a literal no-man's land, Shaw forces her out of a world of petitions and polite advocacy into raw survival mode. The stakes of her cause are no longer only ethical or symbolic. They are existential. And then in Chapter 16, Bendu's inner resources, honed by trauma, shame, and the brutal lessons of Deluma, coalesce into decisive agency. Faced with Varney's ultimatum on the beach and the imminent threat of drowning or exposure, she summons the combat knowledge she had been forced to learn and fights back, freeing herself, blinding Varney with sand and ultimately turning his own gun against him. The scene is both catharsis and moral ambivalence. On one level, it is a vindication. Bendu survives, reclaims control, and demonstrates that a survivor can transform victimhood into resistance. On another level, The episode complicates the novel's earlier insistence on procedural justice when institutions fail, self-defense and extrajudicial confrontation become the only routes left for redress. Shaw resists a simple celebratory reading by emphasizing the battered body and the lingering moral questions, and by staging the uneasy, improvisational justice on a moonlit shore. Ultimately, the chapters together dramatize a grim truth of post-conflict societies. The search for accountability often requires acts that blur the line between lawful prosecution and the run assassin. Eyes of survival. Okay, so let's start our discussion. So how does the novel explore the idea of justice? The novel explores the idea of justice mainly through the efforts of its protagonist, Bendu. Throughout the story, we see her fight for justice in various ways. Initially, she tries to seek justice through the legal system by reporting Moses Verney to the police and pursuing a case against him in court. However, she faces numerous obstacles, including bribery, corruption, and a general lack of accountability. This highlights one of the central paradoxes of the novel. The pursuit of justice is often hindered by the very systems that are supposed to uphold it. As Bendu's case progresses, she encounters a range of characters who represent different approaches to justice. Some, like her friend Agnes, believe that seeking justice is futile in a society marred by conflict and corruption. Others, like her colleague Hassan, advocate for a more pragmatic approach, working within the existing structures to achieve the best possible outcome. Meanwhile, figures like the wealthy businessman Calvin offer support and resources, recognizing the importance of Bendu's cause, but also highlighting the privileges that allow them to take a more leisurely approach to activism. Through these different perspectives, the novel poses complex questions about the nature of justice and the means by which it can be achieved in a post-conflict society. Ultimately, it suggests that the pursuit of justice is not merely a legal or political process, but a deeply personal and often arduous journey that requires resilience, determination, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. So how does Bendu's experience of justice illustrate the novel's central paradox? Bendu's experience of justice perfectly illustrates the central paradox of the novel, which is that the pursuit of justice is both necessary and deeply problematic. On the one hand, justice is essential for healing a fractured society and ensuring that those who have suffered can find some measure of closure and accountability. Bendu's determination to seek justice for the atrocities committed during the war is a driving force in the novel, motivating her actions and shaping her relationships. On the other hand, however, the novel also exposes the many obstacles and even dangers that can arise when seeking justice. Bendu's repeated attempts to pursue her case through the legal system are met with delays, corruption, and threats, underscoring the limitations and even the pitfalls of relying solely on official channels for redress. This tension between the importance of justice and the difficulties of achieving it is a recurring theme in the novel, and it is embodied in Bendu's own experience. Her unwavering commitment to justice is tested and ultimately transformed by the challenges she faces, forcing her to confront not only the broader systemic issues at play, but also the personal costs and complexities involved in the pursuit of a seemingly universal ideal. The novel suggests that while justice may be an essential component of healing and reconciliation, it is also a fragile and contested process that requires constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront the harsh realities of the world. Chapter 17 takes up the immediate aftermath of Bendu's beach confrontation with Bunny and frames it as a moment of exposure that forces private truths into the light. Bleeding, injured, and exhausted, she staggers to Calvin's house, where she is cared for and then admitted to the hospital. The physical trauma demands stitches, but the emotional wound is equally pressing. Surrounded by Calvin, Ciotta and Terence, Bendu musters the courage to reveal the secret she has long buried, the part of her past that Varney threatens to make public. Shaw stages the scene as an inversion. The bedroom, once a refuge, becomes a confessional where family and friends must confront the complexity of her survival. The chapter moves from the immediate crisis of her physical health to a kind of secondary crisis of conscience. What should they do about Vernon? How should they respond to the threat he poses to Bendu and to themselves? And eventually, how should they hold him accountable? The answer must reckon with the possibility that doing so will sully Bendu's reputation, perhaps irreparably. As always, let's begin by considering what happens in the chapter. At the hospital, she is attended by Ciotta and Terence while Calvin stays by her side. After some time, she is well enough to tell them what happened at the beach and that Vernon is threatening to release a tape recording that will damage her reputation permanently. The news is devastating. But in time, she convinces them that the best response is to go forward with the trial against Varney. The chapter mixes tenderness with menace, and it does so brilliantly. We see Calvin rushing to Bendu's aid and looking after her. We see Ciotta being fiercely protective and tending to Bendu's needs. And yet, all the while, the question of Vernon's threat hangs over the group like a dark cloud. And in the end, they can't shield Bendu from the knowledge that justice may require her to relive her trauma, and that this experience will bring shame upon her and her family. The chapter ends with Bendu announcing, "I am not going to let what happened to me ruin my life. I will find a way to make things good again." It's a very powerful line, and one that suggests she won't rest until justice is done. Now let's move on to Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is one of the most significant chapters in the novel. It is here that Bendu finally tells the fullest account of her time in Daluma, and we learn exactly what she endured at the hands of the rebels. As I mentioned earlier, this section of the book uses flashbacks to interweave the story of Bendu with those of other women who were taken captive by the rebels. We meet Marmusu, Hana and Oretha, and we watch as each of them adapt and improvise to survive. And in their stories, we see how the rebel soldiers engage in atrocities, but we also see the resourcefulness of the women who survive. Their survival often comes through acts of defiance, such as Hana's refusal to accept a baby born of rape, or through creating bonds of sisterhood. For instance, when Oretha witnesses Hana's execution, she collects Hana's discarded possessions and lays them on her own bed, a silent and intimate act of mourning. These smaller acts of resistance and the creation of a kind of makeshift family among the women become their bulwarks against the surrounding terror. But the most wrenching confession is Bendu's account of her pregnancy by Samson and her decision to abandon baby girl. This revelation reframes prior ambiguity about her survival strategies. What outsiders might read as accommodation was often a series of impossible choices made to stay alive. She writes, "If I carried this child to term, I would be branded a collaborator. My people would call me a baby maker, the woman who slept with the enemy. But if I allowed my belly to swell and burst, I would be branded a traitor, the woman who bore the enemy's child on her back." Now this chapter, like Chapter 17, uses the domestic setting of Calvin's home as a space to reveal hidden truths. In this case, however, the truth is not only about Bendu's past, but it's also about the past of other women. We learn about the other women in Delum, not through news reports or rumors, but through Bendu's memories. The result is a portrait of the resilience of women in the face of unimaginable horrors, but also an indictment of the casual ways in which the men around Bendu judge her actions. When her cousin, Eugene, learns that Bendu had sex with a rebel soldier, he asks, "How did you let it happen?" And this reflects a broader inability to understand the systematic nature of sexual violence. In war, the men around Bendu want to see agency where none exists. They want her to be able to fight back against Samson when in fact, the odds are so stacked that no one can fight back. The men need to believe that Bendu could have defended herself in order to absolve themselves of any responsibility to do so. And finally, we come to Chapter 19, which begins with a sort of jolt after the intense emotions of the previous chapter. Here we shift from testimony to legal strategy. Bendu, Ciotta and Calvin enter the sleek offices of Thomas and Reeves, a prestigious law firm, where Counsellor Marlon Gray agrees to take the case pro bono. The chapter is notable for its use of setting. The sterile, professional environment of the law office is juxtaposed with the brutal scenes Bendu recounts, such as the checkpoints where a single gunman could decide who lived or died. This contrast highlights both the possibility and the limits of institutional justice. Gray's pragmatic counsel is telling. While a full-scale war crimes prosecution is unlikely without a national commission or tribunal, immediate domestic charges for abduction and assault are achievable and urgent. The chapter thus performs a crucial narrative move. It converts trauma into a public claim with legal traction, acknowledging institutional constraints while refusing quiet resignation. So let's finish by talking about why these chapters are important. The 3 chapters we've just considered mark a decisive turning point in the novel. They take the traumatic events of the past and bring them into the present. In doing so, they transform private injury into public reckoning. Let me put it another way. Up until this point in the novel, the atrocities committed by the rebels have been largely off-stage. We hear about them, we see their effects, but the events themselves are not depicted. However, in these 3 chapters, we are brought behind the lines. We see the day-to-day operations of the rebel army, and we witness the kinds of abuses that ordinary citizens can commit. And in that regard, they are a kind of threshold moment in the book. Until this point, we can think of the atrocities as something that happened elsewhere, something distant and unreal. But now they intrude upon the characters and the narrative in a much more direct way. That said, it's also important to recognize the difficulty of these scenes. By necessity, they depict extreme violence and sexual abuse. Yet in doing so, the novel neither sensationalizes nor eroticizes this violence. Rather, it presents it starkly and matter-of-factly, which itself is a kind of indictment of the casual indifference that allows such horrors to continue. These chapters are essential to understanding the central conflict of the novel. They force those around Bendu to confront the reality of her experience and to consider how they might hold the perpetrators of those abuses to account. They also offer a glimpse into the interior lives of the characters. We see their fears, their hopes, and their struggles to reconcile their experiences with their sense of self. In particular, the chapters highlight the centrality of family and community. Throughout the novel, Bendu has been physically separated from her loved ones, but she remains connected to them emotionally. And when she returns, she is welcomed with open arms. This welcome, however, is complicated. Her family wants to help, but they also struggle to understand the full extent of what she has endured. Nevertheless, they rally together to support her, demonstrating the power of family bonds. If you have comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below.